Boss, we have a lead on that no-good thief.
How's he so fast?
Going somewhere?
This costume took a year and a half to make, and what you're about to watch took another 8 months to edit. Welcome to the full-length movie video of where I made Navia from Genshin Impact. In this video, I'll show you exactly how I made this costume, step by step, the challenges I faced along the way, and how I overcame them. I started editing this series whilst I was still learning editing and narration, so as you watch, you'll probably notice that I gradually improve on both, from the skirt part to the hat part. Trust me, I noticed. I've definitely lost count of how many times that I wanted to scrap the entire series and restart all over again and start editing the whole series again. But if I kept doing that, the whole project would never be finished. Towards the end of the journey, I even entered my cosplay into a competition. And you'll get to see that too in another video. This video is way too long. So without further ado, here's a year and a half of crafting condensed into one complete journey. For the undershorts, I carefully laid out the pattern pieces and cut out 8 pieces. That included 4 front pieces and 4 back pieces. I then sewed the front and back pieces together, and I left the left side seam to sew the zip in later. I didn't record how I sewed the zipper in with the lining because I forgot. However, I did use this video a lot to help me understand how to do it. This video also explains how to sew the waist seam with it too. As I was reaching the finishing line of making the shorts, I only had the hem to go. For the hem, I ironed both the outer layers and inner layer lining on a 1 cm fold. After ironing, I pinned the 1 cm fold in place and matched the crotch and side seams of the outer skirt and lining together. Once the hem was all pinned, I slip stitched by hand the entire hem of the shorts. This took a really long time and the finished result was absolutely worth it. After I finished the shorts, it was then time to cut out all the circle skirts required to make a circle with 10 pleats. I cut a total of 3 circle skirts. I cut along the grain line on each and sewed them all together. I finished the open seams by folding each raw edge, then top stitching over the top. I have no idea what this technique is called, but it worked, so I went with it. The zipper edge I left as raw edges because I was learning. However, in hindsight, I'd probably finish the seam using a bias tape. I pleated 10 pleats around the entire skirt. This took quite a bit of time measuring and repleating to get even pleats, as I wanted to hide the seams to keep the side zip seam on the side. I basted the seams in place using my sewing machine. For the waistband, I decided to cut a buckram insert, as I knew the overlay skirt I would make would need a really strong base to attach onto. I cut a wide waistband out of satin, ironed the interfacing on it for extra support, then sewed the waistband onto the pleats with right sides together. I then carefully inserted the buckram into the waistband and clipped to hold it into place. I then stitched in the ditch to complete the waistband and tried the skirt on to see how it fit. I wasn't quite happy with how the waistband looks, despite on the finished cosplay it wouldn't be seen. It just didn't sit right with me, so I unpicked the stitch in the ditch and shifted the waistband seam behind the buckram, then stitched the waistband closed. This is what the inside of the skirt looks like at the waistband, and this is what the new waistband looks like. I was so much more happier with it now. The next step was to add the gold trim onto the skirt. I cut out multiple long pieces of gold PVC material. I sewed the gold trims onto the skirt hem, and just before I stitched in the ditch, I tried it on, and I did not like how the hem was sitting at all. It looked tacky. It didn't make me think of Navia. It reminded me of a space-themed skirt. So I unpicked the entire trim off the hem and thought of another way I could make the gold trim work. I decided to make a bias trim out of gold satin. To start off, I cut out a large square of satin. Then I pinned the opposite corners to make one big triangle. I ironed the fold to make a crease, then cut along the crease to make two triangles. I pinned both triangles together to make a pointy B shape. I sewed the triangles at a 1 cm seam allowance. I also used the tracing paper for sewing the satin to help my sewing machine feed the material through. After sewing the two triangles together, I unfolded the satin piece into one giant diamond shape. I ironed the seam open, then I marked a 4.5 cm wide lines and crossed the entire diamond. After this, I pinned the diamond sides together in a way where the bias trim lines make a spiral. To do this, leave one strip open, then match all other strips. It's kind of hard to explain without any footage, so here's a diagram to help with understanding. Then I cut from one strip to all the way to the other and to make one big giant slinky. Also, be careful when cutting the bias strip. I cut through a bias strip and I had to fix it using iron-on interfacing. I used a bias tape maker and ironed the entire length of the bias tape. This took a super long time and I ended up with a lot of bias tape. I started pinning the bias tape around the hem of the skirt. Then I realised that was going to take forever, so I sewed the bias trim on and adjusted it as I sewed it on. Once I got to the end, I finished the stitch about 5 cm. I cut the bias tape making sure 1 cm overlapped for seam allowance and sewed the bias tape ends together. After this, I sewed the joining bias tape onto the white skirt. The final step to finishing the skirt was to finish the gold trim by stitching in the ditch. The skirt is now complete and I am so happy with how it turned out. I started off with purchasing 2 pairs of affordable heels for the base. Because I couldn't choose online, so I got both. I chose to use the left pair as the elastic held onto my foot well when worn and they were easy to walk in as well. I 3D printed the pieces with the settings on the screen. I then sandpapered the prints as smooth as I could by hand. For the gems, I sanded and buffed them before prepping them to make a silicone mould. I also hot glued the gems onto the base of the surface so they would stay still in the silicone and not float to the surface within the container. For the remaining prints, I prepared a acetone and wood filler paste to paint over the prints. Each piece needed multiple coats to be applied on to get a thick coat. Thankfully, each coat dried relatively quickly in between. After applying this coating, I then further sanded each piece to achieve a smooth finish. I also use this as an opportunity to experiment painting over the prints. As you can see, some of them were prepped differently. I then sprayed Rust-Oleum primer onto the prints and let dry. Once dry to touch, I sprayed 2 coats of gold spray paint onto the prints. After the mould was made, I removed the prints and poured blue dyed resin into the moulds. After 24 to 48 hours of curing, I began sanding and buffing them until smooth. I brushed off any resin dust and sprayed 2 coats of Rust-Oleum clear gloss. I then cut some mirror paper as backings to the gems for the casings and used resin glue to fix the gems to the casings. I then moved on to making the ankle bows. After preparing all the bow pieces, I sewed together the tie, the bow and the bow tails. I cut the excess fabric around each piece and clipped around the curves before turning it right sides out. I took my time clipping the curves as I wanted a nice smooth curve. I did the same for the bow leaves and the bow ties too. I then ironed all the pieces flat. Unlike what I did in this video, make sure you use a pressing cloth when ironing velvet. Iron the bow leaves together as the edges at a 1.5 inch seam allowance. Fold the bow leaves to get your desired effect and hand sew the bow tie right sides together. whilst around the middle of the bow. Once hand sewn together, trim the excess fabric and flip right sides out. I then hand sewed the bow ties at the back of the bow and flipped the tie so the seam allowance was hidden. And we now have some very cute ankle bows. After letting the gold paint dry, I carefully hand painted black paint onto the 3D prints. Once they were dry, I super glued snap-on clips at the back of the prints and hand sewed the attaching clip onto the bow. I was really happy with how cute they looked. The next step was making a pattern for the boots. I wrapped my leg with glad wrap, then put tape all over. I wore a heel to get an accurate pattern, and I also wore the skirt to achieve the right length, plus a little extra. I drew a line down the centre of the boot and drew notch lines to align the pieces. I then cut down the centre front of my leg. I cut down the centre back and cut the flat part of the heel pieces too. I traced around the foot sole on paper and added a 1 cm seam allowance. I also did the same for the heel, however I chose not to use this piece. I cut out the pattern pieces from the faux gold leather and put them aside. For the front lace piece, I traced 2 lace patterns onto a sheet of baking paper. I then cut out 2 mesh pieces and basted the mesh onto the pattern. I trimmed the lace pieces to size and used clips to hold in place. I zigzag stitched each piece of lace onto the mesh, then overlapped the other lace pieces and zigzag stitched them onto. For the other boot, I mirrored the overlapping of the lace trim to maintain the accuracy according to the character. Also, check how much lace I had after I finished this. I traced one side of the glad wrap shoe cover onto pattern paper. I added a 1 cm seam allowance and I removed a bit off the centre front for the mesh piece. I then cut out 4 pieces out of stretched velvet fabric, with 2 pieces being mirrored. After I cut out 4 shoe cover pieces, I pinned the mesh centre front on, then zigzag stitched it onto the back shoe pieces. The corner lace piece at the foot was really difficult to sew with my machine, so I hand sewed this piece in place. I pinned and sewed the lace along each side of the mesh using a zigzag stitch on the inner and outer side of the lace and trimmed the loose threads. I pinned and sewed a pretty lace detail to go on each side of the centre mesh. I sewed a zigzag stitch on the left edge and right edge of the lace trim. So in total, I did 4 zigzag stitches down the leg on each foot. For preparing the vinyl pieces, I used an Alix vinyl file, uploaded it to my Cricut, then my Cricut cut 2 mirrored pieces of black HTV vinyl. I then used these Cricut tool thingies to help peel off all the unwanted pieces from the heat transfer vinyl. I ironed on the heat transfer vinyl. After letting the vinyl cool, I carefully peeled the plastic sheet off, which was so satisfying. I accidentally broke the vinyl here. Lucky I kept some of the vinyl scraps and I was able to make a vinyl graft. Here is what the iron-on vinyl looks like on the boots. I then matched the calf edges to make sure the glitter vinyl seamlessly matched together and pinned together before sewing. I sewed the pleather sole onto the shoe cover. It slipped around a lot for the first one, so I base stitched the sole on the other shoe cover, which made sewing it a lot easier. I hand sewed the clips onto the shoe to attach the 3D prints. I moved on to modifying the patterns and sewing the black velvet details that sit under the gold thigh piece, and trimmed and clipped the seam allowance before flipping right sides out and ironing flat. I also cut out these knee decorations thingies for the knees. I did these whilst I was doing the bows. I sewed them together, flipped them right sides out and then hand sewed them closed. I hand sewed the pleats in place and then hand sewed one side together. I hand sewed the pleats on the bows. I hand sewed the pretty knee decorations, and lastly I sewed the thigh bow ends together so they made a circle. I printed the garter file at 130%, which was a perfect fit for me. However, increasing the size did cut off part of the stencil, so I had to trace one side, then flip that traced piece of paper and tape it into place. I decided to keep this printed piece as a master copy and prepared a new sheet to trace over. Here is what the stencil outline looks like. I then cut out the unwanted shapes out using a hobby knife. After pinning and tracing the stencil on 5mm EVA foam, I carefully cut along the outlines. I went along with my small scissors and trimmed any overhanging foam pieces to neaten the edges. I then sanded over the edges using a Dremel to further smoothen the edges. I didn't have a heat gun, so I used a hairdryer to heat seal the foam. It's not the greatest, but it's better than nothing. The lower garter is heat sealed and is a lot darker in colour than the top one that isn't heat sealed. At the top and bottom joins, I hot glued the garter edges together, applied a paint primer coat, then applied 3 coats of gold spray paint. I used an invisible thread to anchor the gold garter onto the rest of the shoe, and literally on the night before the con, I finished sewing the garter onto ballerina tights. As you can see, I did try sewing on the garters to normal stockings, but they tore very quickly, so I cut the old stockings out. I couldn't really cut it off completely because it was sewn onto other parts of the shoes, so I kind of just cut out the majority. And I sewed the ballerina tights. The ballerina tights were a lot stronger to use instead. Here are the finished boots. They are the first ever pair of boot covers I've made, and I'm really happy with how they turned out. To start off, I primed the 3D prints with a 50-50 mixture of acetone and wood filler. I used a weeder tool to dig out the unwanted paste from the 3D print details. For this process, I used rough sandpaper, smooth sandpaper to remove the rough edges, a brush to remove dust, and a weeder to remove the coatings out of engravings. I also used a buffer and polisher tool to help smooth the surfaces. After applying the acetone wood filler coats, I then hung the prints to dry. I sprayed 2 coats of paint primer onto the 3D prints. I spray painted the prints gold, and once the first coat was dry, I spray painted a second coat of gold paint. I then painted black paint to add details to the 3D prints. I painted the details of the gem encasing print and also the engravings of the arrow-like prints too. And here is what the prints turned out after painting. I was really happy with how they turned out. After sanding and smoothing the 3D printed gem, I cast a silicone mould. After the moulds had set, I poured blue dyed resin into the mould and let the resin set for 24 hours. After the resin had set, I sanded the blue gem. There were a few bubbles which the resin dust had filled in. Unfortunately, I could not get all the dust out, so I moved on and sprayed 2 layers of clear gloss onto the gems. After using the alcohol marker on the resin, here is what the gem looked like. You can see the markings close up, but it now looks a lot better from the distance. I then used mirror paper as the backings to the gem pieces and used resin glue to hold it in place. I attached the dangly pieces together using 10mm jump rings. Before I could begin making the skirt, I made a mock-up pieces to simulate what the skirt would look like. I made some pattern adjustments, such as lengthening and widening the yellow and black skirt pieces. I was much more happy with the adjustments in the second mock-up. For making the yellow skirt layers, I traced the yellow skirt pattern onto the buckram. This is the first time I ever used buckram before, so I learnt a lot researching about it. For those who also don't know much about it, buckram is a cotton or linen open weave that is soaked in starch to provide firmness. It's used to provide structure, support, and shape to garments. It is actually commonly used in curtain headers, where it prevents the fabric from sagging and creates sharp pleats. It's also used in hat making as well as other items such as tote bags and purses, and in this case we are using it to provide stiffness for the yellow skirt layer, which is really cool to use it in that way. I ironed the buckram to remove the curl from when it was rolled. I initially basted the buckram onto the fabric. I then later found out this method was definitely not going to work when putting this together. I then made a pattern for the yellow ruffles. I measured the length on the yellow skirt piece, then multiplied it by 2.5. The final measurement of this pattern piece ended up being over 3 meters. I sewed right sides together and sewed the short edges closed, just like what I did with the side hip pieces. I folded the ruffle piece and ironed the fold flat. I put 2 gathering stitches along the open edge of the fabric. I then ironed over the long fabric strip a second time. I then began the process of gathering and pleating the satin fabric. This took a lot of time as I had to get both the gathered pleats symmetrical in length, the number of pleats, the same number of pleats, as well as mirroring the placement on both the yellow skirt pieces. Just look at how crisp these gathered pleats are. For the pin tuck trim, I cut out a long strip of fabric, ironed a crease, then pinned the crease down as shown. I ironed another crease in place. After this, I folded both the raw edges behind and ironed flat. I then top stitched the fold down. I also ironed over the trim again. This is what the top stitch looks like so far on the trim. I pinned the folded raw edges, then top stitched this down too. Here is the almost finished version of the pin tuck trim. I did another top stitch over the other fold. I then sneakily secured the fold at the back by sewing over a previous top stitch. I then started making a pattern for the interfacing. The interfacing will be ironed on to provide stability onto the gathered pleats once they are sewn on. I pinned both interfacing pieces on the fabric. I think it's symmetrical. Obviously looking at taking that off for the seam allowance. I wanted to spend some time outside sewing, so I had this table set up ready to go. However, I had so many bees wanting to come and say hi. Every time we got one away, another came along, so I put all the yellow honey looking fabric away for another time. I hand basted the pleats and pin tuck trim on, then sewed over the top stitching to secure the gathered pleats and trim. I then sewed the trim and pleats down on the other side of the skirt. I sewed the gathered pleat layer to the buckram basted satin layer with wrong sides together. For the pleats, I pinned them so as they would be tucked into the seam allowance. I was able to turn the yellow skirt right sides out. You can't really see it in the video, but the buckram did not want to sit flat at the seam allowance. I was not happy with how the yellow skirt looked. So I unpicked the entire skirt. I went back to the cutting table and thought of a different way to put the buckram into the yellow skirt. I cut out the seam allowance of the buckram as I was now planning to make this as an insert instead. I sewed the front and back yellow skirt pieces together. I carefully inserted the buckram layer into the satin pieces. I trimmed off extra buckram so as I could hand stitch the long edge closed with enough seam allowance. Encasing the corner piece was especially challenging to do, so I sewed the fabric corner with my sewing machine. I pinned the seam allowance on the long edge closed, then ironed the open seam flat. When I was flipping the other side of the skirt out, I actually found this really difficult to do compared to the first. I had to secure the black layer of fabric and buckram using pins at the top edge and bottom corner to keep the buckram still. Then I carefully flipped it out. I used clips to hold the fabric and buckram edge together. I was then able to remove the pins. I trimmed a bit more of the buckram so as I could fold the seam allowance over the buckram. I sewed the corner of the yellow skirt piece, trimmed the seam allowance, then flipped the corner bit right sides out. After I was able to encase the buckram, I used clips to hold the seam closed. After ironing the seams flat, I hand sewed a slip stitch from one side of the skirt to the other side of the skirt. It was so great to see the skirt slowly coming together. I stitched, then pinned a strip of gold 4-way stretch faux leather onto the top opening of the skirt. I then stitched in the ditch to close the skirt opening. Off camera, I made one skirt piece folded in similar spots to Navia and mirrored the pleats on the other side of the skirt. I actually had to put some physical effort into this. The buckram is quite sturdy and it needs some effort to bend into place. Despite folding and ironing this into place, I found the fabric wanted to move from the pleats, so I hand sewed at different spots to keep the fabric in place. I also hand sewed the pleats near the waistline of the skirt to keep the pleats in place too. For the black skirt layer, I used my cry cut to cut out a mirrored faux leather details and an identical piece from glitter heat transfer vinyl. I carefully cut and weeded all the unwanted pieces from the faux leather. I then went along with my small scissors to neaten the edges. I also weeded out the unwanted pieces from the glitter heat transfer vinyl. I applied the glitter vinyl to the faux leather using a low temperature on my mini iron. Once the pieces were cool, I carefully pulled away the plastic from the vinyl. With my cry cut, I cut out glitter HTV vinyl for the pretty detail that is shown on the black skirt layer. I thoroughly measured the glitter vinyl from all the edges to prevent it getting caught in the seam allowance. I measured along the long edge to ensure the vinyl was parallel to the edge and ironed it down onto the right side of the interface velvet layer. Once the vinyl cooled, I carefully pulled away the plastic from the vinyl. When I was applying the faux leather to the black velvet layer, it was a little tricky because I was matching a concave edge to a convex edge. However, once it was sewn and flipped right sides out, it will sit very nicely. I base stitched the leather piece onto the black velvet piece and did the same for the mirrored piece too. This was quite tricky doing this as the leather was very slippery and the heat transfer vinyl was starting to slip off the leather too. A base hand stitch would have been very helpful, however I got there in the end with my sewing machine. I then sewed the interface and non-interface velvet pieces right sides together. I clipped all the loose ends, then I trimmed the seam allowance and clipped the curves, then turned the velvet pieces right sides out. For the smocking detail, I sewed a long piece of velvet fabric with a round end. I trimmed and clipped the curves before turning the long piece right sides out. I ironed the velvet piece flat. It was very fiddly. Also, please don't do what I did just here. I ironed velvet without a pressing cloth, which ruins the pile. So when ironing velvet, please make sure you use a pressing cloth. On the black skirt layer, I ironed all the edges flat. I unpicked along the straight edge of this skirt, as trimming and clipping the curved hip edge is a lot easier than hand sewing a curved edge. I trimmed the seam allowances and clipped the edges. Once I did this to both pieces, I flipped the pieces right sides out. After ironing the pieces flat, I folded the layers until I was happy with the fold placing and symmetry. It was then time to work on the smocking. I used pins to mark the alternating folds and gathered markings. This smocking detail was so confusing. It took me so long to get my head around it. I even asked Analik a few times on how to do it too. Anyway, she was able to help me eventually understand it. What I did for the gather, I made 2 folds like this, then stitched in place. I picked up the fold line and pulled it up to where the gather stitch is. I hand sewed the fold at the front, as well as securing the fold at the back. I repeated these steps until the end of the velvet strip. To attach the smocking detail, I clipped onto the velvet skirt layer, then hand sewed it down. I used pliers to assist pulling the needle through the thick velvet layers. For each smocking pleat, I first loosely attached one big half pearl with 2 little half pearls and adjusted as needed to get a placement I was happy with. Once all pearls were placed, I used a small amount of fabric glue to secure the pearls to the smocking fabric. Here is what the finished velvet skirt layer looks like. For the side pieces, I top stitched a navy satin trim onto the side hip piece. After sewing, I ripped off the tracing paper from the back of each side hip piece. I used this paper to reduce the fabric slipping around whilst I was sewing with my sewing machine. I made a pattern for the white satin flowy pleats by measuring the length of the curved edge of the velvet side hip piece, and I multiplied the total length by 2.5 and added a 1 cm seam allowance around the pattern. I pinned the pattern onto a scrap piece of white satin, then cut out the fabric using my rotary cutter. I initially sewed this by sewing straight down the folded satin piece. After I finished sewing the gather stitches, I realised sewing the short edges and corner, then flipping it right sides out would be a lot easier for later. After unpicking, I sewed just the short edge to the corner. I trimmed the seam allowance and ironed the piece flat, then sewed a gathering stitch along the open edge. I then pleated the gathered satin until it was evenly spread and within the seam allowance of the black velvet pieces. I applied clips and pins to secure the pleats. I basted the gathered pleats in place. After basting, I generously pinned the white satin along the black velvet edge. I also checked the white satin edges were far enough from the black velvet seam allowance. I took my time with sewing and slowly basted the white pleats on the black velvet fabric. I then sewed both velvet pieces together with the white satin fabric sandwiched between the 2 layers. I left some pins in the white satin to prevent accidentally sewing the white satin on the corner edges of the seam allowance. I trimmed the seam allowances, clipped the curves, and turned the velvet pieces right sides out. And here is what the finished side velvet piece looks like. I also added snap-on clips to the side hip pieces to attach the 3D prints I worked on earlier. I hand sewed these really big snap-on clips that were strong enough to secure the yellow skirt onto the white skirt. I had to use these clips because the yellow skirt was so heavy. I then hand sewed snap-on clips connecting the black skirt piece onto the yellow skirt piece. And this is what both the yellow and black skirt pieces look like together. I was very happy with how it was starting to turn out. After finishing the skirt layers, I began assembling the bow and bow tail patterns together. I traced the patterns onto craft paper and cut all the copied pattern piece out. This ended up being a lot of pattern pieces for just the bow and bow tails. I rolled out black velvet upholstery fabric, then cut out 4 pieces to make the back bow. I also cut out 2 interfacing pieces for the back bow too. I also cut a small strip of velvet fabric for the strip around the bow. I then ironed the interfacing pieces onto 2 bow fabric cutouts. For the pretty gold details on the bow, I used my cry cut to cut out 2 gold glitter heat transfer vinyl pieces. I peeled off the excess gold vinyl to reveal the pretty detail. I also printed out the black detail that is placed within the gold detail. I then ironed on the gold heat transfer vinyl onto the black velvet piece. Then I peeled it off. It was so satisfying peeling it off and seeing the pretty glitter attached onto the velvet. For the black detail, I tried to do some strategic placements for my cry cut to cut out the details. I wanted to save some vinyl by printing lots of small components compared to lots of big components. I'm not sure if I actually saved vinyl or not with this. I think I saved a tiny bit and used a lot of brain power to play Tetris on the cutting layout instead. Anyway, I then ironed on the black vinyl on top of the gold vinyl. I applied one strip at a time. I applied the long middle layer, then the top sides, then the bottom sides, and lastly I applied the middle one on. And here is what the finished bow piece with all the vinyl looks like. I cut out these pretty trims out of faux leather, then cut out the same shapes out of glitter HTV. I then peeled the unwanted pieces away. I then ironed the glitter onto the soft fur side of the faux leather. I clipped the glitter leather onto the curved side of the bow and then sewed it on. I put the bow pieces right sides together and clipped in place. I sewed each bow pieces right sides together. I stuffed each bow piece with 2 layers of foam. This was actually quite difficult because you really had to stuff it in there. I sewed the ends closed to keep the foam in place, so it would look like this. I clipped the bow together with the glitter vinyl facing on the inside. Then sewed the bow pieces together. Once I flipped it right sides out, the bow looked like this. To sew the middle of the bow, I needed extra hands for this. I broke so many needles and I had to use pliers to pull the needle through. This is what the bow looked like after. And here is what the bow looks like with the 3D prints on. Moving on to the bow tails, I firstly cut out all the glitter HTV patterns I would need. I then ironed my fabric, then cut out the fabric pieces and interfacing pieces. For the bow tail insert, I chose a dark brown satin fabric and cut 4 pieces out for each pattern piece. I then ironed these for a smooth finish with no creases. I also ironed the yellow bow pieces to neaten too. I then ironed on the glitter vinyl patterns for the yellow bow tail pieces, the brown bow inserts, and the brown bow tail pieces. I then ironed on flocked velvet vinyl onto 2 of the brown bow tail inserts. I pinned the bow tail pieces together. I pinned the glitter vinyl pieces together as one piece. For the back of the bow tails, it was one big yellow piece, so I didn't need to do anything to the back side of the yellow tails. I sewed the big yellow piece and the brown piece together. Both these pieces had glitter on them. I used a brown thread for the top stitch and a yellow stitch for the bottom stitch. Next, I sewed the other yellow pieces to the brown piece. I pinned the pretty glitter front to the plain back, then sewed the entire bow tails together. I took it slow around the curves. When I got to the straight edge of the bow piece, I left an opening so I could flip the bow tail right sides out. I trimmed the curves with pinking shears and trimmed along all the curves. After bringing it right sides out, I gave it an iron and then began folding the tail pleats in place. Just look at how pretty it is turning into. It was then time to finish off the brown inserts. I sewed the brown pieces right sides together and left a gap to turn it right sides out. I used my pinking shears to trim the edges and clipped along all the curves before flipping it right sides out. I then ironed flat, then hand sewed the brown inserts closed. I clipped and hand sewed the bow tail folds in place within the layers so the stitches could not be seen. I hand sewed here at the back of the bow to secure the fold in place. I then began the long process of hand sewing clips onto the skirt layers to attach the bow, and also hand sewed a few smaller clips on the bow tails to keep them secured onto the black velvet layer. The bow and skirt parts were now all finished. This was such a massive part of the project. I was so relieved I had finally finished it, and I was so happy with how it turned out. To start off, I traced all the Navia bodice pattern pieces, foam patterns, and as well as the sash pattern pieces. I also printed out a corset pattern that I had planned on using to provide structure underneath. I didn't use this because of time constraints. For the gold centre front trim, I cut out 2 curved strips of 2mm thickness EVA foam, then flipped each piece to be glued down on the wrong side of the gold faux leather. After the glue dried, I trimmed the gold leather to about 6 to 7 mils from the EVA foam. To glue the fabric onto the back of the EVA foam, I first had to prepare the seam allowance before folding the fabric over and gluing the fabric onto the foam. For the concave edges, I snipped into the fabric, and for the convex edges, I cut small V's into the fabric. For the corners, I trimmed diagonally, leaving about 1 to 2 mils of fabric between the edge of the EVA foam and the cut line of the fabric. So when folded, the edges would turn into a corner. I then painted glue on the EVA foam and stuck all the pieces down that we have just trimmed. I further trimmed the edges and folded the fabric onto the glue. I found out the glue wasn't strong enough to bond the fabric, so I had to use clamps to hold the fabric down whilst the glue was drying. Once the piece had dried, this piece didn't turn out well because of the indents from the clips. So I made these pieces a second time, but this time I used heavy books to press down and hold the fabric and glue in place instead of clips. I began making the bodice by starting with the centre front of the bodice, which was the white centre. This piece required 3 layers of fabric. The first layer, closest to the body, is a thick cotton. The second layer, the middle layer, is a white satin, and the third outermost layer was pleated white chiffon fabric. To make the front, I first cut out a massive rectangle of chiffon fabric, then hand pleated and pinned the pleats and hand basted all the chiffon pleats in place. I used a different colour thread to hand sew and secure a strong cotton fabric as the third layer onto the chiffon and satin layers. After this, I carefully sewed all 3 layers together and left the top edge as the opening to flip right sides out. I clipped the edges and unpicked all the hand-basted seams and flipped right sides out. I stretched this piece of fabric by pinning it to my ironing board. I then lightly ironed the opening edge, then carefully hand sewed the top opening closed without hand sewing it to the ironing board. To make the roses, I cut a 85cm by 10cm strip of chiffon fabric. Fold the corner piece onto the fabric, sew it down. Using a wide stitch, fold the edge again so the edges are aligned and sew all the way to the end. Trim the triangle excess flappy piece. Gather the fabric by pulling the thread from each end to your desired effect. Fold the fabric tightly over the starting end to form a spiral. Make sure you have the flower base with your hand. Once you've reached the end, then hand sew through and around the end of the flower to secure the end. Cut the messy edge with your scissors, then hand sew around and around on the base of the chiffon rose, then tie a knot and snip the thread. Now that you've made 1 flower, do this 2 more times so you have 3 flowers. For the black front piece, I cut out 2 pieces of fabric on the fold from the same black velvet upholstery fabric I used for Navia's skirt layer. As the gap between the pattern and the fold was so narrow, I used my heat erasable pen to trace around the pattern piece onto the fabric. After unpinning part of the pattern, I moved pins to help anchor the fabric piece so it wouldn't get in the way of my scissors, and I was then able to cut out the excess fabric from the fold. For the interfacing, I cut 1 piece out. As the interfacing was a lot thinner than the velvet and a lot more easier to handle, I was able to cut out the excess fabric at the fold with a lot more ease. I then ironed the interfacing onto the wrong side of the black velvet fabric and used a pressing cloth, which was my bodice mock-up. I pinned the 2 layers right sides together, then sewed using a 1cm seam allowance. I left a gap at the bottom edge so I'd be able to pull the fabric right sides out later. I trimmed along the entire edge and clipped along all the curves. I then flipped this right sides out, ironed flat off camera, then hand stitched the opening closed. The second piece for the bodice is now complete. This piece was a lot more challenging than the black velvet piece. I cut out 2 pieces of fabric, As you can see, when placing the pattern on the fold, the seam allowances at the bust area would actually go well and truly over the fold line. I actually had to modify the pattern, take out the seam allowance from the pattern so this would work. Then when cutting out the fabric, I traced this section of fabric where my seam should go. After cutting through the fold at the bust, I flipped the pattern and traced where my seam should go on the other side. I did the same method for cutting out the interfacing. I then ironed the interfacing on while off camera. I had to draw the seam again as the iron erased my heat erasable pen markings. I placed the pieces right sides together, then sewed the interfacing and non-interface fabric right sides together and left a small opening along the straight edge. I used my pinking shears to trim the fabric edges down and to prevent fray. I trimmed the corners and clipped along all the curved edges, then pulled the fabric right sides out. I also ironed the piece of fabric flat and then hand sewed the opening closed. The third piece of the bodice is now finished. For the gold side piece, I used my cry cut to cut out this bodice piece. My cry cut actually struggled cutting out the faux leather. It took multiple attempts. I managed to make it work by using the heavy duty cry cut mat and thoroughly rolling the fabric flat onto the mat. I cut 4 pieces. I also used the cry cut to cut out all the decorative details. As the cry cut cutting blade wasn't the most suited for cutting out faux leather, the cry cut didn't fully cut all the way through the fabric. However, it did fully cut through the bigger pieces. I used a craft knife and scissors to fully cut through the pieces. After carefully separating each piece, I placed the decorative details onto the solid fabric piece and layer them out to be the same placement according to Navia's bodice. Once I was happy with the placement of the decorative pieces, I used fabric glue to secure each piece to the solid base fabric. I also pressed down on each piece to help the decorative pieces stick to the fabric. I finished securing the pieces with the glue. I top stitched each and every piece of fabric down. This took a lot of time, going slowly with majority of the stitches and even hand wheeling the machine. I also tied knots at the back of the fabric to further secure the thread. I didn't record this, however I sewed the fabric pieces right sides together with a narrow seam allowance. I clipped along the curves and I left a gap to turn the fabric right sides out. I inserted a 2mm EVA foam piece into the bodice piece, then hand sewed the opening closed. For assembling the bodice together, I started by pinning the black velvet piece and navy piece together. I hand sewed 2 rows of basting stitches to secure each piece together. I sewed the 2 pieces using my sewing machine, then did a second stitch to make it look similar to Navia. I then unpicked all the hand-basted stitches out of the bodice. My sewing machine skipped a few stitches, so I hand stitched this spot down. When I was attaching the gold piece to the bodice, I wanted to display all the top stitching, so I actually hand sewed the edge of the gold piece to the edge of the navy fabric. Here is what the stitches look like up close. For the white center, I hand sewed the gold foam pieces down onto the white fabric. I hand sewed this through multiple layers for it to be secure, and I sewed through the back of the gold pieces to hide the stitches. Fun fact, for majority of this project I actually tried to avoid using fabric glue. I hand stitched the white center to the velvet part of the bodice. I then hand sewed the chiffon flowers onto the front. This navy triangle piece will be going right next to the gold panel piece. I cut out the interfacing from a scrap piece of fabric and then cut out 4 pieces from the navy fabric. I then ironed the interfacing on 2 of the fabric pieces. For the back panel and side panel that has all the black crisscross details, I cut out some skin coloured lycra. For the side piece and the black detail on the back, I cut out these pieces out of black mesh fabric. To achieve the crisscross detail, I first copied the crisscross pattern onto tracing paper. I pinned then zigzag stitched the elastic onto the black mesh fabric to replicate the placement of the same crisscross effect as shown on Navia's bodice. The crisscross patterns on each side of the mesh were not identical to each other, that being the crisscross elastic mirrored each other instead of being identical, so the elastic had to be placed differently for each. I machine sewed the elastic in place using a zigzag stitch. I pinned then sewed the two back mesh pieces together. I clipped the corners and trimmed the fabric and flipped it right sides out and ironed flat. I then sewed the back mesh piece onto the skin coloured fabric for the back. After sewing the mesh onto the skin coloured fabric, I then sewed the two skin coloured back pieces right sides together and with the mesh being on the right side. I left a small opening on the back piece so I could easily flip it right sides out. I then trimmed and clipped the curves. For the back navy panel, I cut out 2 pieces of interfacing and 4 pieces of navy satin. I pinned the non-interfaced to the interfaced pieces right sides together and now have 2 bodice pieces, that being a left back piece and a right back piece. For all the decorative pieces, I used my crafter's knife to cut each piece from 3mm EVA foam. This turned out to be a lot of pieces in total. To make each piece gold, I traced over each piece onto the gold faux leather. I used double-sided tape to cover the entire area where I traced all the foam pieces. I then pressed the tape down onto the fabric to further secure it and began peeling off the red cover of the tape. I used my weeding tool and tweezers to remove the tape cover. I began placing all the foam pieces down onto the tape. I stuck all the matching pairs down with each piece mirroring each other. This would mean that each piece could go on either the left and right side of the bodice back. I separated each piece, then carefully clipped and trimmed around the concave and convex curves. I used my weeding tool to fold the sticky fabric onto the foam pieces. I then did the same process for these pieces, which would sit at the upper back of the bodice. And here is what the finished pieces look like. I also did this piece too. I found this shape to be the most challenging out of all the pieces, and this was mainly due to how small this piece is. I first stuck a pin to mark the center, then used my weeder tool to poke a hole. I used my scissors to snip the fabric within the hole of the foam. I then folded the inner fabric pieces onto the foam. Then folded the sticky fabric onto the foam and trimmed the excess fabric where needed. I found the bigger foam pieces a lot easier to do compared to the smaller foam pieces. I trimmed away the excess sticky fabric, snipped along the inner curves, then snipped small V shapes from the outer curves. Then I folded each piece down onto the foam, so when flipped it would look like this. After folding the fabric down onto the foam, I found that the tape wouldn't stay stuck permanently and would slowly fall away with time. So to overcome this problem, I hand sewed each piece of faux leather down. I started off by pressing all the pieces down onto the back so it would stay stuck for the meantime. I then hand sewed through the gold fabric pieces and alternated from left to right side as I was making my way through hand sewing each piece down. At some points it was difficult to push the needle through the fabric and the sticky layer, so I used a thimble which helped push the needle through. For smaller edges like the pointy edge, I did more stitches to secure the fabric wrapping. After hand sewing all the fabric wrappings down, I finished off the thread and tied a knot. The hand sewing is complete and the gold wrapping is now secured. I did the same process with the larger pieces by firstly folding the sticky fabric down onto the foam. I hand sewed from the pointy ends first, then secured the thread by tying a knot when I ran out of thread. I also secured fabric on the wider edge too, by using a wide stitch as I alternated from each side to secure it down. After a long time, I had finally finished hand sewing and securing every piece. These were all the back and side pieces for the bodice. I sewed the interface pieces and skin coloured lycra pieces together and sewed all the non-interface satin and mesh pieces together to the non-interface pieces. I sewed the crisscross mesh pieces by sewing each navy piece to the mesh piece first and stopping at the wire seam. I then sewed the 2 navy pieces right sides together and pulling aside the corner edge of the mesh piece so that it's out of the way of sewing. The next step is to sew a zipper in the bodice. I pinned then hand stitched the zipper to secure it onto the fabric. I then used my machine to sew on the zipper. As the zip is an open end zip, I sewed one side right sides together, then sewed the fabric on the other side of the zip together. For the seam at the zip, I sewed this folded, so the closing would be easy to do when flipped right sides out. I'll explain this in more detail later. I then sewed it all the way around the bodice right sides out. In hindsight, I wouldn't do this, and I'll explain why when I show you. Anyway, in this clip, I sewed the interface and non-interface pieces right sides together for the entire bodice. I sewed the centre back together. I slowly sewed it together and carefully readjusted my sewing foot as much as needed. For the triangle piece, I made sure I pulled the pointy edge out of the way to include sewing the edge of the triangle piece in place. I had my pins purposefully placed to match the interface layer seams with the non-interfaced fabric seams. I finished sewing the seam at the zip opening. I snipped the seam allowance for the curved edges for the pieces, then trimmed the seam allowance with pinking shears, and then trimmed the curves for the bodice edges. I also trimmed and clipped the mesh and lycra fabric pieces to reduce bulk. I believe I sewed the triangle incorrectly on this side of the bodice, so I unpicked, then tied off the seam and hand sewed it closed. I used tweezers to remove all the pieces of the tracing paper that I initially used for stabilizing the mesh fabric. I flipped this right sides out. This is the part that we talked about sewing the fabric on the fold. Now that it's flipped right sides out and the fold is sewed in place, it is now really easy to have a neat finish. All that needs to be done is press the seam allowance and hand sew closed, and we will have a clean and finished seam. So this is the other part with what I mean about sewing the left and right side of the bodice separately. See how the centre back channel would be too narrow to pull right sides out? So to combat this, I unpicked the seam. I hand sewed a stitch to close the centre back, then tucked the seams within the bodice layers on each side and hand sewed these closed. Flipped each piece right sides out from it, then hand sewed these pieces together. The navy centre back is now connected. I sewed the boning channels around the mesh pieces for stability. I had a lot of difficulty cutting the spiral steel boning. I tried doing the snipping, the spiral edge technique, but it just would not work. I actually had to use the angle grinder to cut it. I capped the edges of the spiral steel boning to stop the boning edge cutting the fabric, then inserted the boning through the channels. Then I hand sewed the channel openings closed. I attached the skin coloured part of the bodice back by hand sewing it to the other back piece. I started off by placing all the pieces onto the bodice to match the back of Navia's bodice. I hand sewed all back pieces on individually by hand. This part alone took about 14 hours a day for about 2 days to completely sew each piece securely onto the bodice. I hand sewed a navy stitch around the entire edge of every piece individually to anchor it to the bodice. I anchored each piece by sewing through the gold leather and stitching through the navy satin of the bodice. If the gold leather was too thin, I had to sew through some of the EVA foam instead. This task of sewing all these gold pieces on overall required sewing through thick and difficult to pierce through fabrics, pushing the needle through at awkward angles. I had sore fingers and the needles would pierce through my fingers and make them bleed from trying to push the needle through the thick materials. Depending on the size and complexity of each piece, the duration of properly securing one piece on could be anywhere between 30 minutes to a few hours. The back of the bodice was now finally complete. I made some bodice panel inserts too. I actually thought the bodice was going to be too small for me. However, it turned out to fit fine without the inserts. I tried on the bodice and it was slowly but surely coming along together. It was now time to add all the extra details on. I used my cracker to cut out gold heat transfer vinyl. I weeded out the design, then ironed the vinyl onto the front of the bodice. For all the decorative details, I 3D printed them, then once they were finished, I removed all the support structures. I sanded and prepped all the pieces by layering a few coats of acetone and wood filler mixed together. I painted a layer of the mixture on the prints, then let them dry, then repeated this again. I did this until the layers were thick enough and the prints ended up looking like this. I further sanded the prints to make them smooth, then I weeded out the built-up mixture sitting within the detail engravings. I brushed away any excess dust from sanding the pieces, then repeated the process of sanding and brushing until I was happy with how the pieces looked. After prepping the pieces, it was then time to prime the pieces before painting. I sprayed a layer of paint primer onto the prints and then let the prints dry. I superglued snap-on clips onto the backing of the 3D prints so that they can snap onto the bodice when I sew the clips on later. For the sash wheels, I used acrylic paint to paint in navy blue in the area as shown. For all the bodice pieces, I used black acrylic paint to all the grooves for detailing. I also painted the center of the wheels in black too. The front and back of the bodice was now completely finished. Now that we've finished the bodice, it was time to make the sash. I cut out all the sash pieces out and sewed the pieces right sides together. I trimmed the edges and clipped the curves, then turned these pieces right sides out. The side hip pieces were straightforward and easy to make. However, the front sash piece was where it got really challenging. What helped me get my head around this was flipping one piece right sides out, then pinned one of the other sash pieces to one side right sides together. Then sewed these pieces down, then pinned the other piece mirrored onto the other side with right sides together, like how I did it here. Sewing all these pieces became very thick for my machine to sew through, which caused skip stitches, so I hand sewed these gaps closed. After sewing and flipping right sides out, the sash should look like this. As we cut out 4 of these pieces, and we've just sewed 2 of these down, get the other 2 pieces that I sewed along the curve off camera and pin this right sides together to these pieces. I tucked the other sash piece within the sash pieces I was pinning, so that I could pin all the way around the fabric edge. With this pinned, sew it together and flip it right sides out. I had to push this later down into the sash pouch to make it look like a sash. I deviated from the pattern in this step, but for all the openings on the sash pieces, I actually hand stitched the openings closed. I also hand sewed the pleats in place for each piece, then I hand sewed the front sash piece to the side hip sash pieces. For the final part, I hand sewed large clips onto the sash to attach the hip wheels. For the plate that sits on the front of the bodice, I sewed multiple small clips to hold the plate in place. I sewed clips to attach the center back pieces too. For all the pointy arrow prints on the front of the bodice, I hand sewed 2 clips for each piece so the pieces would be secured and would not move around if bumped. I attached the sash onto the bodice by hand sewing clips onto the left and right side of the bodice, as well as hand sewing clips to attach the end pieces of the sash on the back of the bodice, with the end of the sash being hidden by the skirt back bow component I made in the part 3 video. And with that, the entire bodice and sash for Navia was now complete. I used my cry cut to cut out the designs for the necklace. I first tried cry cutting on the back of the glitter canvas, which didn't really work. I tried again, however, on the glittery side, which also didn't work. I then tried glitter felt, which at least partially worked. I first cut out the center necklace piece, which almost failed, but luckily the cry cut was almost finished. Then cry cutted the side back pieces with a lot more ease. The cry cut was able to cut out majority of the outline of the front and back pieces of the necklace. The smaller, more intricate details did not fully cut through, so I used my crafter's knife to slowly and carefully cut out all the small details. I first worked my way all the way around the front necklace piece. I then moved on to cutting out all the decorative details of the necklace, starting off with bigger and easier shapes, then moving on to harder and smaller pieces after. I also used small scissors and a weeding tool to assist in removing the pieces. After a few hours, this is what the front piece looked like. I then moved onto the back felt pieces and repeated the same process as I did for the front piece. This took a really long time to do, but the process was so worth it once it was all finished. Now let's move on to the next step. To achieve this darkened look for Navia's necklace, I roughly cut out 3 layers of black mesh fabric for each necklace piece. This ended up being a total of 9 mesh fabric pieces to make the necklace. I roughly cut out heat and bond paper around each of the felt necklace pieces. I then ironed heat and bond onto the backings of the glitter felt pieces and then trimmed the excess heat and bond from the necklace outline. I had to trim this carefully around the edges so I didn't accidentally cut the felt. I spent more time ironing over the big necklace piece to ensure the heat and bond was securely bonding to the fabric. After this piece had cooled, I peeled this piece off from the pressing cloth. Then again trimmed around the edges, and then ironed over for a second time. Once I peeled away the paper backing of the heat and bond, I wasn't a fan of the sheen in the details within the necklace. So I again used my craft knife and tweezers to remove all the shiny heat and bond pieces from the front and back pieces of the necklace. I probably could have cut out the pieces whilst it still had the paper backing. However, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it really mattered as the unwanted pieces were removed and it was a lot quicker to do than removing the felt pieces. This is what they look like after it had all been removed. I then ironed the necklace pieces onto a single layer of mesh on both the 2 back pieces and the front piece, whilst also using a pressing cloth too. I pinned the 2 other layers onto the necklace pieces. I then top stitched along the entire outline of the necklace piece, as well as all the detail outlines too. This took a very long time of top stitching. I trimmed the excess mesh fabric and then the front and back pieces were finished. For this tiny detail on the necklace, I used the cry cut to cut out these pieces from smocked heat transfer vinyl. After the pieces were cut, I used the weeder tool to remove the excess fabric and cut out the tiny pieces to separate them. The smocked heat transfer vinyl feels similar to what velvet fabric feels like. I then ironed the pieces on to make the necklace look like this, and this is where these pieces went. I used a 3D printer to make the decorative pieces. For the beads on the necklace, I sprayed painted pearl beads with a primer, then gold spray paint, and did the same with the 3D prints. I carefully painted black acrylic paint onto the necklace pendants to add detail. I first started with the center pendant that had the most detail, then carefully painted the side pendants too. I also used a tissue to quickly remove any accidental smudges I had made. For the dangly pearl, I glued these dangly pieces onto pearls to make 2 pearl pendants. Whilst they were drying, I threaded the pearls we sprayed painted before. However, I alternated by threading pearl, then gold bead, pearl, gold bead, etc. until I had a length that I was happy with. I then did another strand for the other side of the necklace. I threaded through a jump ring on each of the pendant pieces. To thread the pendants together, I first started at the centerpiece. I secured the wire onto the pendant by wrapping the wire around and around on itself, which I tested to see if it could hold up, and it did, and it felt secure. I threaded on more gold beads and 3D printed beads too. I secured the wire onto the side pendant, which I used the same wraparound wire method, and then tucked the small excess within the other beads. This part was a little fiddly, however we got it to work. I did the same process to attach the front to the other side pendant. After threading the beads on, I twisted the wire, then cut the wire. I couldn't thread the wire back through for ending each piece, so I ended up wrapping the wire around on itself. This actually worked well and you couldn't really see it from afar. Then I attached all the other 3D printed beads and gold beads onto the sides of the necklace. After completing this part of the necklace, I first had to sew the front glitter felt piece to both back pieces. I then used a pressing cloth and ironed over the necklace to flatten the seams. It was now time to attach all these pieces onto the glitter necklace piece. I attached the dangly pearl piece onto the pearl and gold bead strand. I think at this point I realised the jewellery fishing line was just not going to tie off, so I ultimately decided to thread the jewellery wire through the beads whilst they were still on the fishing line. This actually worked pretty well, transferring the beads from the fishing line onto the wire, and I was able to do it pretty quickly too. I attached the pendants to the felt necklace by piercing a jump ring through the felt, then connecting and closing it to join to a jump ring that joins to the pendant. I did the same for the ends of the pendant necklace and pierced the jump rings through the mesh fabric here. I then began planning my placements of the pearl gold bead strands and 3D print details. I glued all the clips on the backings of the 3D prints. I glued one clip on each of the smaller clips and glued 2 clips on the centerpiece. After this, I then positioned the matching clip pairs onto the necklace. Once I was happy with the positioning of the clips, I held the clips in place and hand sewed the clips securely in place. I finished the thread by securing it at the back by back tacking and tying a knot. I did this once the clips had set on the 3D prints. I then sewed a jump ring onto the necklace, then connected the necklace end to the sides of the felt necklace. I then secured the front part of the beaded necklace by hand sewing it to the felt necklace. I also sewed hook and eye closures to the back edges of the necklace. After giving some time for the silicone molds to set, I neatened up the edges using a crafting knife. I use these molds for the necklace gems as well as for the gems for another part of the project. After the resin had set in the molds, I removed the pieces. I sanded the flat surfaces and smoothed down the rough edges from the mold. And of course using PPE whilst completing this process. The sanding process I did involved using sandpaper first, then brushing away excess resin dust. I then moved on to using this buffing block. Started off with filing, then smoothing, then buffing, and lastly polishing. And after all this, I brushed off any excess resin dust. Then sprayed 2 layers of clear coat onto the gems. I then cut out some reflective paper to give the gems more dimension. Here is what the gem without the paper looks like, and here is what the gem with the paper backing looks like. I traced these out and used my crafter's knife to cut the paper out, then positioned the reflective paper backings in place. I double checked the paper was the correct size for the gems and trimmed the excess paper. And also checked this with the paper and gem within the casing and super glued them in the 3D printed casings. I put some more super glue on top of the reflective paper to secure the gems and then left it to dry. I thought this process was going so smoothly and was turning out great. Well, unfortunately they didn't dry great. The glue had bubbled up and reduced the amount of reflection it had previously. This was a bummer to learn this, but I can say that I definitely have learnt a much better way of achieving the reflectiveness in the gems without the bubbles in future. I unfortunately didn't have enough time redoing this component of the costume, and instead, this is what the finished product looks like. I made a set of mock-up gloves out of black mesh fabric. I made one for the right arm as a gloved one and the left arm as a gloveless one. This worked for the short term, but I wasn't too happy with this. This pair was made early into the Navia project, even before I had finished making the skirt layers, and I bought a Nailix pattern to help after making this. I also patterned my own bows too. I first tried it out on some scrap fabric and some scrap heat transfer vinyl. I was happy with this, then I cut out the blue vinyl using the cry cut. I then ironed these strips onto some blue satin pieces I prepared earlier. And then I realised I ironed these pieces on the wrong side of the fabric. So I had to start again. I pinned a new set of pieces right sides together and sewed this in place, as well as cut out some more vinyl. I then ironed the seams flat. I also made a test bow piece by inserting felt, which I was happy with, and proceeded to do the same on the other pieces. So I ironed these strips on the blue fabric one in the middle of each side, between the seam and the crease. I did this to all 3 other bows, then peeled the protective plastic off the vinyl once cooled. I then stitched the top and bottom edge like I did here, and then sewed a piece of white felt along the seams too. Then flipped the bow pieces right sides out at the gap that I made from unpicking the middle of the seam. Then hand sewed this closed using a slip stitch, and then tied thread around the center of this piece to make it look like a bow. For the yellow bows on the shoulders, I sewed 8 bow tail pieces of fabric in pairs to make 4 bow tails in total. For the main body of the bow, I had 8 pieces and sewed the pairs together along the curved edges. After sewing all these pieces together, I cut the edges to prevent fray and clipped the curves and pulled these pieces right sides out. I then did the exact same thing for the bow tails. I wasn't very careful with doing these, so I accidentally made a hole in the end, which I fixed up with a few stitches. After hand sewing the seam closed, and after flipping right sides out, I hand sewed 2 bow tails together. I pinned then sewed these bow pieces together, then flipped these pieces so the seam would be facing inwards. And for the bow's body, I folded the bow in half, hand sewed halfway down from the fold, then folded the unfolded part over the bow and hand sewed in place to achieve a bow. I made a strip of fabric for the ties to wrap around the center of the bow. I sewed together, trimmed the excess seam allowance, then flipped right sides out, ironed this flat, and then hand sewed this onto the bow. I then flipped the tie right sides out, then hand sewed a clip on the back as well as 3D prints on the front. I used my 3D printer to make the accessories. Then the 3D print failed. On only 2 pieces luckily, the rest were unaffected. I 3D printed the other 2 pieces for the vision and it worked. These pieces here were also parts for the hat. To prepare the prints, this time I used a Dremel to sand the prints and it did really well. It made the process a lot quicker. For all the gem pieces, I hot glued the gems down in containers and made a silicone mixture with an equal amount of part A and part B, then mixed thoroughly together. This silicone was actually really good, so if you want to get some for yourself, I have it linked in the description. I then poured the silicone over all the pieces and let the molds cure over 24 hours. Whilst the models cured, I primed the prints and sprayed 2 coats of gold spray paint on the other pieces. Now that time passed, the molds were set and I cut away the excess silicone away from the mold. I had poured dyed resin into the molds and removed once they were cured. I sanded all the resin pieces, initially using sandpaper, then using this file block for finishing, starting with filing, smoothing, buffing, and finishing with polishing. Then lastly, brushing all the excess resin dust off the pieces and sprayed clear gloss spray to give the pieces a shiny finish. To make all the gems shiny, I used double-sided tape to stick the gems onto the reflective paper, which the gems ended up looking like this. For the Geo Vision, I cry-cutted the vision out of orange reflective paper. I attached this again using double-sided tape. This worked well with sticking it together, so I cut the excess tape off. As a side note, because I had 2 layers of the GeoVision paper, as well as multiple layers of double-sided tape, the gap between both the sides of the orange vision and the gem was quite wide, which I think for future projects, placing the vision design in the resin whilst it was curing would be a better alternative. For this white sleeve component, I had a whole bunch of scrap fabric from the white skirt I made. So I cut a whole heap of these pattern pieces out. There were so many, and this was only for a tiny part of the costume. I also ironed on interfacing to the mirrored back pieces on the white sleeves. I realised I hadn't cut the centerpiece on the fold for either of the sleeves correctly, so I modified the pattern so it wouldn't need to be cut on the fold, then cut all these pieces out again. Here is all the newly cut fabric and interfacing pieces. I first sewed the side panels together and sewed the joining centerpiece last because this process was way less confusing for me. Each arm required 2 front and 2 back sleeve panel pieces. Then began sewing each numbered piece right sides together. I used tracing paper to help feed the fabric through the machine. Sewing all these pieces took so long. Here's what these pieces look like once all sewn up. This was the front piece and front interfaced piece, and this was the back piece and the back interface piece. After sewing, I then top stitched the sleeves down, then mirrored this on the other side of the sleeve, and I did the same thing to the front. I clipped all the loose threads and carefully scalloped the edges on all the seams. Then I pinned the non-interface to the interface pieces together for each of the front and back sleeve pieces with matching the seams together. Then carefully sewed the front sleeve together and the back sleeve together. I trimmed and scalloped the outlining edges, then turned the pieces right sides out. I clipped the opening closed to be hand sewn shut later. I used the cry cut to cut out lots of shiny and sparkly gold pieces, then ironed gold HTV onto white satin pieces. I measured the positioning of each gold piece to roughly get these pieces even before ironing them on. After letting these cool, I removed the protective plastic off the sleeve and it was starting to look amazing. I then ironed a sparkly gold on top of the HTV to finish off the sleeves. Some of these gold pieces actually fell off from their pressing plastic or were way too small for safe handling, so I used some spare and bigger plastic from previous vinyl when ironing these on. This is a close-up of all the gold glitter pieces we've applied. And with that, the white sleeves are now finished. As this piece wasn't very big, I decided not to make a mock-up, so I cut out the original pattern size pieces out of the velvet fabric. These pieces included were foam to add volume and the velvet pieces. I soon learned that this piece was not going to be big enough for my arm size, so I modified the pattern pieces at this spot so it would be on the inner arm and hidden. I first drew 2 lines on the cuff pattern, which I then readjusted a line to be closer to the edge. I was happy with the new lines, so I began to cut out along each line to make separate pieces. It's also important to draw a perpendicular line across all the pieces to easily align the pieces later. On a spare piece of paper, I measured the gap I wanted to widen the sleeve cuff. I taped the main cuff body edge by aligning it with the straight line. I drew a long perpendicular line on the paper, then aligned the pattern pieces using the horizontal line and did the same for the edge piece of the pattern. I then added extra tape to secure the pieces down. I used my French curve ruler to readjust the curves on the sleeves of the newly altered pattern. I marked the midline of the center front, then drew a line on the paper too. I cut the paper out to make it a manageable size piece, then folded the paper on the back side along the drawn center front line. Then added some tape along the adjusted side. I cut around the adjusted paper on the fold so that the side would be mirrored. I then removed the smaller unadjusted side of the pattern and taped the center front down onto the newer and wider pattern side. The pattern piece for the foam insert was now finished. After this, I made the pattern piece for the velvet cover, which I traced out on the tracing paper and added a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I cut out 2 foam insert pieces from the new pattern. I cut out 4 velvet pieces of fabric, then sewed right sides together. I also drew a line for the narrow seam line using a heat erasable pen. I then trimmed the seam allowances and clipped the curves. I then flipped the cuff right sides out, then pressed the seams flat using a pressing cloth off camera. Then carefully fed through the foam insert, which actually worked quite well for this piece. The other foam piece broke in half, which I hand sewed back together to put the foam insert in. I then positioned these vinyl pieces onto the fabric and then ironed them in place. After the vinyl cooled, I removed the protective plastic off the vinyl. To finish these pieces, I firstly hand sewed the openings of these pieces closed, then hand sewed the edges together to make a cuff. I tried the fit from the original pattern and it was too small, so I had to alter the forearm brace pattern for it to fit. I also had to alter the gold foam pieces too. This oval piece I didn't have to alter because I made no changes to where it will be placed on the pattern. I then ironed interfacing on one side of the velvet. I then sewed the interface and non-interface pieces right sides together. To be able to turn this piece right sides out, I left an opening on the side of the cuff. After sewing the forearm brace together, I trimmed the seams, then clipped the curves and flipped right sides out, and tried the brace on, which fit quite well. I hand sewed the opening closed. For these details, I cut out the shapes from 2mm EVA foam. I then covered these pieces with gold faux leather and double-sided tape. I trimmed triangles out of convex curves and clipped the pleather for concave curves. I then folded the gold pleather over onto the EVA foam and trimmed where necessary to neaten. I then did the same for these pieces too, and for the corners at the edge, I trimmed diagonally like so and folded it over. And here were all the freshly wrapped foam pieces. For these details and more complex shaped pieces, I broke them down into tackling one curve at a time. I first firmly pressed the EVA foam onto the double-sided tape, then trimmed away the excess pleather. For this corner here, I snipped the fabric like so, and did the same for all the corners on this piece too. I cut out small triangles along these edges, then for the center, I used this tool to poke a hole in the middle, then used my scissors to clip the corners. I then folded the faux leather onto the EVA foam starting from the inside, then folding the leather from the outside onto the EVA foam. I used scissors to cut out this big piece of unwanted leather, then clipped the leather around the entire edge of the inside. I did the same process as before, starting with folding the inside first, using tweezers to assist in placement, and scissors to trim where needed. After folding the entire inside, I then moved to folding down the leather on the outer side. I trimmed where needed, then finished folding around the decorative end. And here is all the finished pieces. Over time, the folded pieces were peeling off the foam, so I had to press them down again, then hand sew these pieces down like I did on this piece. For all these details on the cuff, I actually compared my altered pattern piece to the vinyl pieces to scale and just increased the size of the vinyl to get these pieces the right size, then cry cut them out. For the cry cutting settings, I had mirror off and used the smart iron on glitter vinyl option. The cry cut the pieces out. I ironed the glitter vinyl onto the fabric and removed the protective layer once it cooled. For the centerpiece, I repositioned the gold pieces with the foam piece to check and double check symmetry. I then ironed the centerpieces on. I trimmed off the excess vinyl, then ironed on the loose edges onto the brace. Then hand sewed the brace center back edges together. I hand sewed the gold foam pieces on. I slotted the gem we made earlier partially under the foam and hand sewed this tiny foam piece on, which also secured the gem. I also did the same for this big gem too, and the brace part of the gloves is now finished. I removed all the unwanted tiny pieces from the front and back part of the glove. To make the gloves, I ironed the glitter details onto mesh fabric to make a lace-like fabric. After this had cooled, I trimmed around the side edges. I positioned these vinyl pieces in place, then ironed on a different design for the palm hand and back hand of the glove. After they cooled, I peeled off the protective plastic layer. After the decorative pieces were secured, I trimmed the excess mesh around the upper edge of the glitter lace. For the body of the gloves, outside the video, I previously traced my hand onto a pattern, then traced the pattern onto stretch velvet fabric. I roughly cut out the glove out of stretch velvet fabric. I used scrap fabric to make the gloves and had the nap in their direction towards the fingers. So if you're wondering why I'm aggressively stroking the fabric, this is why. I then matched up the rough glove pieces and pinned together with a good amount of pins to prevent the fabric from slipping around. I then sewed the fabric along the outline to make a glove. I carefully sewed along the trace line for the fingers and carefully sewed a narrow seam up along the edge of the next finger. I then trimmed the excess fabric and separated the fingers. I carefully trimmed around the thumb and fingers and was very careful not to clip the stitches. I then flipped the glove right sides out to try it on. It did feel a bit snug to wear, but this didn't really bother me. For the lace detail we made earlier, I sewed a hem along each of the bottom edges. For the mesh detail, I hand sewed one seam edge fully together, and for the other side only sewed halfway for ease of taking the glove on and off. I hand sewed the seams flat to the lace, then flipped right sides out as the lace part was now finished and ready to be attached to the glove. I then hand sewed the lace mesh detail to the glove, as the glove was a stretchy fabric and the lace detail was non-stretchy. I had to wear the glove on my hand, stretch it where needed, and hand sew the lace detail with the seam and centers matching. After the lace had been fully secured to the glove, I then trimmed away part of the glove so that the mesh would now be see-through. The glove felt a little snug to wear, but it was something I could get used to. And the glove is now finished. For the main body of the sleeves, I first cut out pieces of stretch velvet fabric. The front and back of the gloves were different shapes near the wrist, so I cut out 2 of each. I used a heat erasable pen to mark on the fabric where the darts would go. I used my cry cut to cut out the decorative pieces for the front and back of the glove. I used a weeding tool to remove the unwanted pieces. This is for the back of the wrist and this is for the front of the wrist. I then ironed on the black glitter vinyl on the top and bottom glove pieces, then gently removed the plastic once the vinyl had cooled. I clipped around the edges of the fabric and vinyl and removed the fabric behind this tiny little detail, then marked out the darts onto the gloves. I sewed the darts in place on both the front and back pieces, then carefully positioned the gold glitter detail onto the glove and ironed thoroughly. I then peeled the protective plastic off the gold vinyl. I then carefully positioned black smocked vinyl on top of the gold detail and checked that it was symmetrical, then ironed this on too. I then sewed the gloves together by matching the front and back glove pieces right sides together. The gloves fit nicely around the wrist, however it felt a bit snug on the upper arm, so I created a velvet insert to sew in on the inner arm, which made the glove fit really well, and this insert was well hidden once all the glove pieces were together. I couldn't fully sew to the end point, so I had to stop here and hand sew the rest of it. To make this glitter detail of the sleeve, I used the cry cut to cut out the vinyl decoration off camera, then used a weeding tool to remove all the unwanted pieces. To make this upper arm lacy detail look like lace, I ironed on heat transfer vinyl onto the black mesh fabric. Once the vinyl had cooled, I peeled off the protective plastic, then carefully cut out the excess fabric. I first folded a hem for the glove and then pinned the glitter piece inside. I then sewed the lace glitter detail we made previously onto the upper edge of the arm. This involved a lot of stopping and starting and readjusting to secure this piece on. Here is what the upper part of the glove looks like. I then hand sewed the white sleeves to the inside of the cuff, as well as hand sewed the long sleeve as the innermost layer on the cuff. I also used snap-on clips for the 3D prints and the bows to easily attach and remove. Here are the completely finished gloves. I'm so happy with how they turned out. I made this lace detail by using the cry cut to cut out a design from heat transfer vinyl, then used my weeding tool to separate the unwanted pieces. After that, I used tweezers to pick up and carefully remove these pieces. I roughly traced and cut out mesh fabric for the glitter vinyl, then traced this piece a second time to make the lace darker, then traced around all these pieces a third time to make it darker again to achieve the shade I wanted. I then ironed on the vinyl onto a single layer of black tulle. I pinned all 3 layers of tulle in place. I then top stitched around the outline of the vinyl, as well as top stitched around the middle lace outline too. Here are what the finished stitches look like at the back of the lace. After I cut the excess tulle out, the lace detail is now finished. I cut out 4 of each bow pattern piece and interfaced 2 of the pieces. I pinned the matching interface and non-interface pieces facing right sides together and sewed these pieces in place along the curved edge and left this as an opening to pull right sides out. I trimmed the seams and clipped the curves to all the pieces and turned this right sides out. I sewed the matching pair of pieces right sides together with the interface being on the outer edge, so that when I flipped this right sides out, the interfacing would be on the inside of the bow. I also sewed a few strips of fabric together to wrap around the bow. I first pinned, then sewed together. I trimmed the seam allowance, then used a loop turner to pull right sides out, and lastly pressed flat with an iron. I then sewed all these bow pieces together and clipped all the loose threads. I pretty much folded the bows in half, then folded each side in half again in the opposite direction. I actually hand sewed this in place. I then placed a smaller bow on top of the bigger bow, then secured these in place by tightly wrapping it with a velvet strip I made earlier. I then flipped the strip of fabric so the seam was hidden. I also made a yellow bow from satin fabric and used the exact same process as I did before. For the bows that are placed underneath the brim, I sewed a snap-on clip to attach the 3D print. I also sewed on 2 clips to the back of the bow to anchor this onto the hat. And here is the finished bows. I 3D printed decorative pieces and these gems to make molds for resin. After sanding, I spray painted these pieces gold. I painted black detailings on this 3D print, and on the dangly piece I painted a brown gold colour on. I then threaded wire through the beads and connected all these pieces together. For the gems, I made a silicone mold by hot gluing 3D printed gems in a container, then pouring silicone into the mold to cure. Once this had set, I made a resin mixture and dyed the mixture with blue alcohol dye and poured into the molds. Once the resin had cured, I used sandpaper as well as a filing block to file, smoothen, buff and polish the pieces. I then sprayed 2 coats of clear gloss, which made them nice and shiny. I beaded all the pieces together. I made this gem shiny by cutting out some mirror paper to place behind it. I stuck the gem and mirror paper together by using double-sided tape. I then stuck more tape on, then cut away the excess. I peeled the protective sheet away so it was ready to stick. I then stuck the gem inside the casing. Then glued a snap-on clip on the center back of the print. This was so it could clip onto the bow. I cut a long wide strip and a long narrow strip of velvet fabric and marked the smocking lines. I've lost some of the videos for how I made the hat smocking. However, I followed the exact same process as making the smocking for the skirt layers. I used pins to mark out the alternating folds and gathered markings. This smocking technique took me quite some time to understand when I was making the skirt layers. As I've already now made the skirt layers, I know how to do it now for the hat. What I did for the gather, I made 2 folds like this, then stitched in place. I picked up the fold line and pulled it up to where the gather stitch is. I hand sewed the fold at the front, as well as securing the fold at the back. I repeated these steps until the end of the velvet strip. This is what the finished smocking detail looks like. I did the same process for the bigger piece. I sewed halfway to the gather, then folded again, and hand sewed this in place. After folding the fabric up and sewing this in place, I also hand sewed the fold at the back to anchor it down. To make the roses, I first made 3 different size patterns for each. The navy rose was the biggest one, with the 2 yellow roses being the same length, just different widths to make one smaller than the other. I then cut out each piece out of their respective fabrics. I folded a corner of the fabric like so, then sewed along the short edge. I then picked up the long edge to align with the other edge, and sewed all the way along this piece using a long stitch of about 3.5 to 4 mils. I trimmed the corner and scalloped the edges. I gathered the stitches as much as I could to my desired effect and then tightly wrapped it on itself. Once it was fully wrapped, I trimmed the loose edges, then hand sewed to secure the rose in place. I fluffed out the roses just a little bit more to give it some more volume. I tied a few knots to secure the thread, then trimmed the excess thread. And here is the finished roses. I did the exact same for the navy rose. I gathered the stitches, then tightly rolled it on itself. I hand sewed it close, fluffed the rose out a little bit, and here are all 3 finished roses. For this gold detail, I first cut out the pattern as a reference, and just in case I needed it to be cut by hand. The cry cut kind of worked cutting this piece out, so I had to use the crafter's knife to finish cutting out the pieces. I then glued these pieces with the fluffy bits sandwiched inside. I glued separate diamond-shaped pieces on top of the display side, so now it was ready to be attached to the hat. I cut out 2 pieces of EVA foam for the brim of the hat, then trimmed down from the centre for a better fit. For the crown of the hat, I cut out a long strip of 5mm thick EVA foam and cut off the excess. For the top of the crown, I also cut a 5mm thick EVA foam circle and adjusted the fit. I glued the foam onto black velvet. Once all these pieces dried, I flipped the pieces over, and to my surprise, it looked so bad, and there were fabric bubbles everywhere. I was so disappointed this had failed. The only piece that didn't fail was this piece. I tried to rectify this by moving a hot iron around to warm up and melt the glue to get rid of all the bubbles, which this kind of worked. However, as the glue cooled down, the bubbles would form again. I was so disappointed I have to remake this again, but a lot of the foam and fabric also went to waste. I wasn't happy with this outcome, so I went back to the crafting table, this time using spray adhesive. So I pinned then traced these pieces out again using 2mm thick EVA foam and marked a landmark to help me align these two pieces together later. After spraying the adhesive, I let the brim pieces set on the fabric. And for this piece here, I sprayed adhesive and used paperweights to stop the foam from bending upwards. After drying, I checked the fabric side, and it was looking so much better. After all these pieces had stuck to the velvet, I began cutting triangles along the seam allowance to assist with folding over the fabric. After I glued the brim of the hat down, I also clipped triangles in the allowance and glued these down too. I did this to the top of the crown of the hat. After the glue dried, I began removing all the pins I had placed. To add structure to the brim, I taped wire onto one of the brim pieces and hand sewed the wire in place by tacking it to the velvet triangles. I remarked the notches on the brim for easier visibility. I took these pieces back outside and sprayed a good amount of spray adhesive on both of the pieces. I then matched the notches on each of the pieces and stuck these pieces together, and it was starting to look so good. I then wrapped the top of the hat together. This was also a new long strip of foam as I had cut the other too short. I marked where I needed to trim the excess foam. I cut the excess foam using a crafter's knife. I then reassessed the length and I was happy with the fit. I trimmed the excess at the corners. I marked where I previously cut the excess as I actually liked the amount of allowance I left on this piece. And for the other end of the piece, I did the same thing, clipping both the corners and pinning the seam allowance down. I then double checked the fit, which was pretty good. Now that it was just right, I applied glue to the foam and folded over the seam allowance onto the foam and used pins to hold it in place. I attached the top and base of the hat by hand sewing them together. I used pliers for this because it was really difficult to pull the needle through. I then sewed the two edges of this piece together. I finished the stitch by pulling the needle through the inside and tying a knot. The crown part of the hat is now finished. I then pinned the crown of the hat onto the brim, then hand sewed this together too. This got really difficult at times and you did have to put some work into it. I actually had to use sewing forceps to push and pull the needle through the fabric. I marked then cut off the excess foam on the brim, then glued down the seam allowance by sandwiching between the two layers of the brim. As this glue was good for initially holding in place, but not strong enough to hold when wearing the hat, I went around and hand sewed this edge. And the body of the hat is finished. Now it was time to assemble the hat. I first placed velvet smocking and bows onto the hat. I attached the smocking by hand sewing this onto the hat. I first placed the pearls onto the smocking to get a nice placement, then used glue to secure these down. I glued pearls onto the big smocking pieces, then hand sewed the yellow bow, the lacy detail, then the navy rose, both the yellow roses, and lastly I sewed a fluffy ball and feather on top. The hat is in the final stages to being finished. Now it was time to flip the hat over and attach a few more things to finish it off. On the under edge of the brim, I hand sewed two clips in place to hold the black bow in place. After putting almost everything together, I found the brim pieces were not actually staying stuck together. So I hand sewed around the entire brim of the hat to secure it in place. This took hours. I then attached this piece by hand sewing around the entire decorative piece using invisible thread. And the hat is now finished. The cosplay is finished. Making Navia has been an incredible journey of learning, growing my sewing skills, and pushing myself further than I ever did before. Looking back at where I started and where I ended up, I'm incredibly proud of how this cosplay turned out. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing the full sewing process and found it helpful for your own sewing or cosplay journey. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you left a like and subscribed. And if there's another cosplay or sewing tutorial that you'd like to see from me, let me know in the comments below. As for Navia's journey, this isn't quite over yet. The next chapter is taking her to a competition. So if you'd like to see how this cosplay went in the contest, keep an eye out for the next video. Thanks again for watching and bye for now.